welcome to Survival of a Nation, Lesson 5. The title of this afternoon's class is Israel in Perspective, Viewpoints on the Land's Identity. And the reason that this is the title of the class is because today we are going to be talking for the first time, right? Most of our classes start off with some sort of video of some sort of recap of a moment in the Six-Day War, and then we use that as a springboard to discuss whatever it is. And today, that springboard or that moment in the war is post-war. Okay, so what many historians like to call the seventh day. So Israel, in other words, there's a couple of questions here, but really, we have to remember that at the time nobody knew it was going to be the Six-Day War. It wasn't called the Six-Day War yet, right? And there were a lot of decisions needed to be made militarily, and they had to decide that this war is not going to continue going into and to have a ceasefire with nations around them. And then once it was done, then it was time to process. And the Jewish world, certainly Israel, but the Jewish world as a whole, had to stop the process. Wait, what just happened? And that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to talk specifically about something which I'd imagine all of you are familiar with, but still I'm going to explain it properly. Something called cognitive dissonance, right? So cognitive dissonance is when we have certain expectations for how something is going to play out. And then the way it plays out is completely dissonant or removed or has a totally different result than the way we thought it was going to play out. And we're left wondering, hold on, I thought this was going to happen this way. It happened this way. What was wrong? How do I bridge that gap? It's not unusual for us to find ourselves in such a situation. A common analogy that's used, and I'm going to give this example because we'll come back to it a few times, is imagine if you feel that you're not on such great terms with your superior or employer or whoever it is, and your expectation is this is going to lead to you being fired. And you start calculating how long your savings will last with the current economic climate, like COVID and this. I can apply for unemployment, but how much am I going to get? Can I make ends meet? How quickly do I need to find a job? I have a little bit of savings. You're thinking about all this. And finally, your boss tells you that tomorrow at 12, we have to have a meeting. And you already start getting ready for it, right? And then you come into the meeting and he informs you that we're so proud of all the work you've been doing here, et cetera, and we want to give you a promotion or a bonus or whatever it is, or send you off on a company paid vacation, whatever it is. So this causes the psychological discomfort that I think we're all familiar with, which is called cognitive dissonance. In text 1, this is described. Mickey, since you're the mental health professional, we'll ask you to describe cognitive dissonance. Go for it.
What page are we on?
We are on page
182.
I knew that. Just making sure.
Okay. New events may happen or new information may become known to a person, creating at least a momentary dissonance with existing knowledge, opinion, or cognition concerning behavior. Since a person does not have complete and perfect control over the information that reaches him and over events that can happen in his environment, such dissonance may easily arise. Thus, for example, a person may plan to go to a picnic with complete confidence that the weather will be warm and sunny. Nevertheless, just before he is due to start, it may begin to rain. The knowledge that it is now raining is dissonant with his confidence in a sunny day and with his planning to go to a picnic. Or, as another example, a person who is quite certain in his knowledge that automatic transmissions on automobiles are inefficient may accidentally come across an article praising automatic transmissions. Again, at least a momentary dissonance is created.
And the theory of cognitive dissonance goes that if we're in a situation where we have cognitive dissonance, we always, as human beings, what we do is we strive to reconcile what happened between the two. And we do that in all sorts of ways, right? My favorite example of cognitive dissonance, which is not brought here in this book, is the trip, right? Has anybody ever seen anyone trip on anything? So let's say you trip on the floor. There's nothing there on the floor, right? What happens immediately? Everybody looks down at the floor. Even if they know the whole floor was clean, they do that sometimes for other people. Like to show, I wasn't expecting to trip. Why did I trip? And maybe they look down at the lintel if that's what it is that they tripped over, right? Or the doorstep or whatever it is, or if you've been to Chabad, the little the dip in the floor that happens when you go from the hallway, at least the bathrooms, you're going back to the shul. The little dip there. So we're all familiar with it because we go to Chabad all the time. But when somebody comes for the first time, very often they'll trip. Immediately there's this look back, right? Why? Because that's us. It's just tiny. It's momentary. But that's us striving to reconcile what happened. I was not expecting to trip, right? I'm a perfectly good walker. I know what I'm doing. And yet I did. There must be something there that's going to help me bridge that gap, right? Very often, a very negative side effect from cognitive dissonance is blame, right? We immediately, we do this subconscious, like a knee-jerk reaction. We look for someone to blame, right? And we blame that person, even though if afterwards when we process, well, we're like, no, it's actually my own deficiency. But why did we blame them? Obviously, it's ego a little bit, but it's also because that provides the reconciliation that I'm looking for the cognitive dissonance. Everybody with me? So back to our example, this fella that comes into this meeting, he's hearing something in this meeting that he completely did not expect to hear. In other words, he's hearing that he's going to be getting a bonus or a raise, whatever it is, and he totally didn't expect to be hearing that. So he has probably many options, but what immediately comes to mind are two options. One is, he walks out of the meeting, he's like, oh my God, I just got a promotion. Like, what just happened? One reconciliation that he can have for the dissonance that there is in his cognition would be, he says, it must be that I misread everything. I just had a big mistake. Maybe I even need to start rethinking how I even read my relationship with my superiors, because clearly I was totally off base. They're very happy with me, right? Or maybe somebody's a little more cynical, or maybe was a little bit more certain and he has more things to point to prove that his bosses were not happy with him. The reconciliation for the dissonance that he has in his cognition might be, no way that they're promoting me. He must just be promoting me because they really want to fire me, and they want it to hurt even more, right? Or maybe they just need me for another 3 months, and then they're going to fire me, or whatever it is, right? Which is another way of reconciling the cognitive dissonance that there is. Why am I talking about this? Because the Jewish people, and Israel particularly, had a major cognitive dissonance of what was going on. The expectation for the war, and then the result of the war, and now we're 55 years later, there's no new piece of evidence that can know it. Clearly, there was a major dissonance there. And the question is, how do you reconcile that? And a lot of people, there were kind of different theories that formed. And that's going to be the topic of today's lesson. Okay, and I think you'll find it to be extremely fascinating. So let's start off by just seeing the extreme of of how things progressed, right? And as a result, we'll see the cognitive dissonance from dissonance reduction. We should have been showing these earlier. Okay, so this brings us to our video for today. I should have shared that with the sound. There we go. Please turn your attention to the video screen. Oops. Please hold with me for 1 minute.
The Arab plan for June 1967 was straightforward. The destruction of Israel in the most absolute sense, meaning the capture of its every city and village, and the merciless massacre of every Jewish citizen. A catchy slogan bandied about by the leaders of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan was, "We will meet you for lunch in Tel Aviv." But after just 6 days of war, the forces of annihilation had been all but annihilated, while victorious Israeli forces were ready to deliver the lunch directly to the plates of the same Arab leaders in their respective capitals. The IDF had achieved their dream objectives of capturing the strategic areas of the Golan Heights, the Gaza coastal strip, and the Sinai Peninsula. Israel had freed its seaport from Egyptian blockade, and it had inadvertently captured the entire West Bank as well. Israeli forces were now in a position to storm the Arab capitals of Cairo, Damascus, and Amman. But the thought of entering Arab capitals frightened the Israeli political leadership, who were loath to awaken that great bear, the Soviet Union, that threatened to join the war on the Arab side. The same concern prompted the United States to urge Israel in the strongest possible terms to halt its advance. Israel obeyed. As it lowered its guns, Israel looked back and gasped. She had gone to war on June 5th with the primary hope of surviving the combined Arab threat at all costs against incredible odds. But she had more than survived. When she accepted a ceasefire on June 10th, her territory had more than tripled in size. She had expanded in all directions from an indefensible 8,000 square miles to a robust 26,000. She now embraced all of Jerusalem, almost all of biblical Israel, and many ancient and sacred Jewish cities and sites. Israel's abrupt reversal of fortune read like a page out of the Bible itself. Just a fortnight earlier, Israel had designated national parks as mass cemeteries. It had dug 10,000 graves in advance and made plans to evacuate Jewish children to Europe to escape the promised bloodbath in the streets of its cities. Fast forward 6 days, and the nightmare had failed to materialize. The country was awash with relief, but also with grief. Upwards of 750 IDF soldiers made the supreme sacrifice, and more than 4,000 lay wounded. The Israeli Air Force lost 46 of its 200 fighters. Israel was a small country with an enormous heart, and she bitterly mourned each lost soul. On the Arab side, the casualties were far higher. Approximately 15,000 Egyptians, 6,000 Jordanians, and 2,500 Syrians had been killed, roughly 23,000 lives in total. Every nation on earth gasped in astonishment as Israel slipped out of the Arab noose that had already began to tighten around her neck with relatively minimal losses and maximum territorial and military gains. The modern, well-equipped, and much vaunted Arab armies had been pulverized beyond recognition. The Arabs had lost Jerusalem, and the Jews had regained the site of their biblical temple. But most astonished of all were the citizens and leadership of Israel. They had best recognized the gravity of the danger they faced, and they were now first-hand witnesses to a staggering and swift reversal unprecedented in history. Israel and Jews around the world breathed a collective sigh of relief and celebrated the remarkable turn of events that would be forever known simply as the Six-Day War.
Okay. So that's a cognitive dissonance if I ever heard one, but they're not satisfied. The people who put together this lesson are not satisfied with that. They want us to read it inside. So Lon, if I can ask you please to read for us. By the way, I highly recommend this book. Text 2 is an excerpt from Michael Oren's 6 Days of War. It's a very authoritative not commentary, but historical accounting of the 6-Day War. So he's describing first the dire expectations. So go ahead, Lon.
Okie dokie. Throughout the country, thousands were hurrying to dig trenches, build shelters, fill sandbags. In Jerusalem in particular, schools were refitted as bomb shelters and air raid drills were practiced daily. Most buses and virtually all taxis were mobilized and an emergency blood drive was launched. An urgent request for surgeons, quote, in view of the tough conditions they must be physically fit and experienced, was submitted to the Red Cross, and extra units of plasma ordered from abroad. Special committees were placed in charge of gathering essential foodstuffs, for replacing workers called to the front, and for evacuating children to Europe. Upward of 14,000 hospital beds were readied and antidotes stockpiled for poison gas victims, expected to arrive in waves of 200. Some 10,000 graves were dug. The sole bright spot in these otherwise morbid preparations was the unprecedented outpouring of sympathy from around the Jewish world. If these gestures did little to relieve the sense of approaching catastrophe, of the Jews' abandonment to yet another Holocaust, what are you waiting for? Anna Zeimer, deputy editor of the Daily Devar, accosted Prime Minister Levi Eshkol. He retorted with a description of Israel's international isolation, of the massive casualties it would suffer. But Geisen bei Wasser. Okay, it's another language. I was wondering. He concluded in Yiddish, blood will run like water. There was talk of the widespread bombing of Israeli cities, of an entire generation of soldiers being wiped out.
So, and I've heard this from first-hand account of people that were there, and even Jews who lived in America. People were anxious is not even the word, right? And from there, as we know, 6 days later, right, just 6 days of war, and boom, on the other side of it, things were like crazy. Joanne, can you read for us, please, text 3? From another book on the war by Tom Segev, Israel, the War and the Year That Transformed the Middle East. Don't forget to unmute. Sorry, I muted you during the video. I muted everybody like that. There's no feedback. And text 3 is on page 184.
The sense of total doom had all but disappeared. History was about to begin again. Two popular jokes drive home this reversal of mood. According to the first, told before the war, a sign hangs near the boarding gate at Lod Airport, asking the last one out of the country to turn off the lights. In the second, after the war, two officers are talking about how to spend their day. Let's conquer Cairo, one proposes. The other replies, but what will we do after lunch?
These are two great jokes. And by the way, it says a lot about Jews in general, right? As we know, Jews go through everything with humor, right? They're the most dire circumstance, they have a joke. Last one out, turn off the lights, which is a very morbid joke if you think about it, right? And then on the flip side, now that we won, and it was like, and by the way, you know that Israeli commanders actually toyed with the idea of going in to the opposing countries and showing them that, you know, don't set up with Israel, because they had the ability then, they really had the upper hand then, and they could have gone to Cairo or to Damascus or to whatever it is. And they chose not to. They chose to hold their hands back. So clearly the cognitive dissonance is great. And every person who looks at the 6 Day War has to draw their own conclusion. And at the time it was Jews the world over and Jews in Israel, has to draw the conclusion of how do I reconcile why this was the expectation and this was the result. And that's the question on page 185. And I'd like to ask you all to think about that. What are some of the ways in which Israel and Jews around the world rationalized the remarkable 6 Day War victory? And I want to take a moment to encourage not only those that are here, but also those that are watching the recording. I know Rochelle Weiss and Nick Rodriguez and Wally Limbacher and pardon me if I'm forgetting, and Maraika Sutter, and all those that have reached out to me to tell me that they're watching the recording each week. So take a moment now to think of some of the ways that you know that Israel and Jews around the world rationalized this cognitive dissonance. Anybody want to chime in? Adrian, you want to try to give us some thoughts on this? What went wrong? What was wrong with our expectations to the results, or what went right? I guess she stepped away from the computer. Anybody else want to jump in here?
Sure. I think that if as rationalization for why it worked out, I think that I rationalize it that we were on the right side of history. Israel meaning, and their preemptive strike and their success in the battle, they were prepared to and smart enough, strategic enough to prevail. And I think that felt like they were on the right side of history. Like the good guys won. The good guys won. I
understand that, Lon. So first of all, that part I'm going to disregard because that's not a rationalization. That's just a comment. You're saying you feel that it's the good guys that won and they were on the right side of history. You did mention one point, which is you feel that they were militarily prepared. But with all due respect, all military personnel agree that they were not well prepared, or at least the expectation beforehand was that they weren't well prepared. And afterwards, so is your reconciliation basically that the Israeli commanders all made a terrible mistake? They all thought that they were ill prepared, but really they were much better prepared than they thought? Is that the rationalization?
Well, I think strategically they were prepared. When they knew what they were facing, they made a plan. They didn't just start the war that morning without a plan. They did have a plan. I do think that rationale that they were strategically prepared when it came time to go, it was the rationale.
I think the question I'm asking will become clear as we start going through some of the answers. But essentially what I'm asking is, I'm looking specifically for how do you rationalize if we had gone in thinking we're not prepared enough, and then we realized we were more prepared. I don't know that you can go from 10,000 graves to 750 losses in total, right? No army prepares enough graves that they think in the worst case scenario. They prepared 10,000 graves because they thought at minimum we're going to need that, and we're probably going to need more.
Okay, well, you could go further and describe what you're talking about.
So basically, we're looking for a rationale between why the expectation was so low and the results were so spectacular. Joanne,
It
you
had
want-
to be divine intervention, right?
okay, so you're suggesting it might have been miraculous, divine intervention. Okay, and that's going to be that's for sure one of the answers. Joanne, you want to mention something?
I think just historically, because the Jews have usually been on the losing end, that there was that feeling that they're never going to make it. I think that was, you're saying, what was the mindset that allowed them to think that they wouldn't survive?
So
That was that.
they just had terrible morale. In other words, they literally.
Well, they didn't have terrible morale, but they had history
No.
behind them.
So my point is, you're saying that they actually were prepared enough, and they were equally matched to all the Arab nations, and it totally makes sense that they could have won. Just that in their minds, they felt pretty terrible. Okay, and which
Well,
is what Milan is mentioning.
The other thing is what we talked about before, that they did initiate that preemptive strike. If they
Okay.
hadn't, it might have been a very different outcome.
Okay, so what I'd like to present today, and a lot of these comments that people have mentioned are definitely going to be a part of this, but I'd like to present today are 4 perspectives on how to look at it. And I'm not giving you 4 perspectives that, right? So again, I'm not giving you 4 perspectives that I'm presenting. I'm giving you 4 perspectives. If you look in different camps, different people, depending on their background, their religiosity, their viewpoints on Israel, etc., came up with different answers to solve this cognitive dissonance. So again, to recap, what are we looking for? Before the war, Israel was preparing for disaster. After the war, there was an unbelievable victory. How do we reconcile? How did Israel and the Jews around the world rationalize the remarkable victory? And after the war, they end up getting split into 4 camps. Very briefly, I'll go through, and then we'll go through one of them at a time. Number 1, we're going to talk about is what Adrian mentioned, divine intervention. It was miraculous. Personally, that's the view that I ascribe to. The second is more of an atheistic approach that actually, which I think is kind of what Joanne and Lana mentioned, which is, no, there's an actual explanation that the threats were exaggerated, and it was just in our minds. We thought we were so small and they were so big, but it turns out we actually had major military advantages. The third explanation, the third rationale that people give, which is mainly the religious anti-Zionist group, and I hope I won't upset too many people, but we want to try to present all the views here. Their perspective is that it was actually what they call Maisa Satan, which means the works of Satan, or because they're anti-Israel. They can't attribute this to divine miracles, so they actually believe this is part of the works of the negative force, the evil forces that there are in the world that came to the support of Israel, and we'll talk about that. I know a lot of you right now are appalled by such a perspective. But
I'm not, because that's part of what I said about the good guys and the bad guys. So I actually,
okay.
the bad guys were losers, and that's how it fits.
Well, in this case, they're suggesting that Israel was the bad guys, and that the fact that Israel won is because it was Satan's perspective. We'll get to it when we get there. And the fourth perspective that we're going to give is the religious Zionist perspective, which is something called Aschalta de Geula. These are huge movements of people, by the way, that till today, this is the way they look at this. Aschalta de Geula means that this is the beginning of the redemption, and it's kind of like this is the beginning of Mashiach coming. So, like, obviously, that's what's going to happen. Like, yeah, we don't see that coming because we don't see Mashiach coming, but that this is the beginning of Mashiach, and that's why this is what happens. These are 4 camps of explanations that we give, and then we're going to end off with one more powerful point, which we'll get to at the end. I'll keep that as a surprise. Now. So let's start with number 1. Okay, number 1 is divine intervention. Divine intervention is essentially a camp of people that, and this is, I think this is probably the most widespread perspective, which believe that the victory was a miracle from God. And that was also the most immediate perspective, by the way, shared by the most amount of people. On June 6th, right after the war, the front page of Yediot Achronot had the words Etzba Elokim Hi. Etzba Elokim Hi means this is the finger of God, and that's that's paraphrased from the words of the Egyptian sorcerers when they finally came to terms with the fact that the plagues that were coming upon them were actually from God. It was in the beginning they felt they were able to achieve the same thing through sorcery, and eventually they said Etzba Elokim Hi. This must be the finger of God. This is recognized as the finger of God. That was the front page of Yediot Achronot, which for those of you that are familiar with Israeli media is a leading newspaper or a very popular newspaper in Israel. Rafi Eitan, who was the commander of the paratroopers of the 35th Brigade, and who later served as the chief of staff of the IDF, said after the war, and I quote, "Apparently, someone in heaven was watching over us. Every unintended action they took and every unintended action we took always turned out to our advantage." Okay? And so this is a camp of people, a perspective. And by the way, this is why, right? So this is a camp of people or a perspective that believes that the entire victory of the Six-Day War was miraculous. I should point out the reason I say there were so many people at the time, this was also visible in the attitudes of many people. For instance, a couple of days after the Six-Day War concluded was the holiday of Shavuot. Raise of hands if you've been to Israel for Shavuot. Anybody? Okay, I have. It's probably, I mean, there's a few amazing times to be in Israel. You know, being Hanukkah in Israel is amazing. Being Yom Kippur, everybody says is amazing. Being Sukkot is amazing. Anyways.
Yeah. If you get a chance later, take them out.
So, hold on.
I was there for Shavuot.
Okay.
Sorry.
So
Yes.
then, and were you
Twice.
at the Western War? Were you at the Western War?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's
What do they call it?
unbelievable story.
Regalim.
Shalosh regalim.
Aliyah Regalim.
Aliyah l'regel, right? Which means because in the times of the Holy Temple, these 3 holidays were pilgrimage holidays and everybody would come to Jerusalem. So therefore, many, many people come to Jerusalem. Now, the reason Shavuot specifically is unique is because on the night before Shavuot, as we all know, we spend the entire night awake and studying Torah. Many people conclude that night by davening shacharit immediately at sunrise, so 5 o'clock, 5:30 in the morning, whatever it is, and then moving on usually to a nap and then the rest of their day, right? The dairy meal, etc., the rest of the Shavuot celebrations. So if you go to the Western Wall, it's an unbelievable experience. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people, tens of thousands for sure, of people praying at the Western Wall. So that first Shavuot, without any, coordination or any 200,000 Israeli citizens. I want to remind you that there were only 2-3 million people in Israel at the time, right? 2-3 million Jews in Israel at the time. 200,000 Israeli Jews showed up for services at the Western Wall for Shavuot night. They cried, they prayed, you speak to people over there, it's an amazing experience, and they thank God for his incredible miracles and salvation. There's also, by the way, strength, and a lot of people credit the Six-Day War, which there was already from the 60s because of the whole hippie movement and then, not caring what anybody else thinks about your movement. There was already a big, what they call Baal Teshuvah movement, which means people that were returning to God and returning to observance, etc. And this really added to that. There was a lot of people who looked at this like, wow, this is like a miracle from God. And that added to them realizing that they should really become more and more religious. And of course, this also affected Aliyah, the Aliyah numbers, right? Lon, can you read for us, please? Text 4, page 185. No, I'm sorry, Lon, you're muted. There you go.
According to numbers from the Jewish Agency, North American Aliyah jumped from 739 in 1967 to nearly 6,500 2 years later, peaking at over 8,000 immigrants by 1971. In the UK, Aliyah numbers were 299 in 1967, with over 1,700 immigrants in 69. Numbers from South Africa show a similar trend. Immigration was at 233 in 67, and more than tripled to 803 emigres by 1970. Until the Six-Day War, Western Aliyah was not a major force, said Sidney Shapiro, director of Telfed, the Israel office of the South African Zionist Federation. The wave of post-1967 Olim changed the face of Aliyah. For the first time, there were sizable numbers of immigrants from the West, as comparable to just a trickle.
So until the Six-Day War, Aliyah was like something that if Israel was a little better off, then remember, Aliyah is a very personal thing. Each person individually needs to decide to make Aliyah, right? So if you're a Jew in Algeria, and actually it's getting more and more anti-Semitic because it's very Muslim and very Arab, right? So then of course you're going to make Aliyah. But the Western countries, Canada, the US, South Africa, these places weren't making Aliyah as much. And after the Six-Day War, these numbers really became a trend. And really, I would say that trend continues still today. In other words, it's much more common to see people making Aliyah, as we know. I mean, the wise men from our community just made Aliyah just recently, right? And many people have this as a dream in their lives that at some point, maybe they have to wait till their kids are grown up or whatever it is, and then they make Aliyah. But can we say, right? So that's a couple of things that that the Six-Day War affected, right? And the aftermath of the victory, there was a widespread awakening to Judaism. There was an uptick in Aliyah, etc. But and of course, there was an increase in Jewish pride around the world. But can we say that it was a miracle? Okay, miracle is a big, big word. Think of miracles that you know: the splitting of the Red Sea, the biblical miracles, literally. Splitting of the Red Sea, blowing a shofar and the walls of Jericho fall down. Can we say that the victory of the Six-Day War was a miracle to that degree? So for this, obviously, we have to start off by defining the word miracle. So we'll start with the online Oxford Dictionary. It's on page 186 in your book. The word miracle has two definitions, one more intense than the other. The first one is an extraordinary and welcome event that is not explicable by natural or scientific laws and is therefore attributed to a divine agency. And number two, a little more subtle, is a highly improbable event or development that brings very welcome consequences, right? So think in Fiddler on the Roof, when I forget his name, but he goes, wonder of wonder, miracle of miracles, right? I don't know that you could really ascribe that to number one, a surprising and welcome event that's inexplicable by scientific laws, that he ended up being able to marry the girl that he married, that a little tailor was whatever, right? That kind of thing. I don't know that you could say that that's what he means by miracle of miracles, but maybe number two, it was highly improbable that he ever would have been able to marry this girl. And now he's saying it's wonder of wonder and miracle of miracles, right? Is everybody with me here? Okay.
Yes.
Let me take this up a notch here for a second. Imagine, right, let's do a little thought experiment here for a second. Imagine a thug is about to shoot an old woman, right? He's got his gun out, the old woman is right in front of him, and he is hit by a falling meteorite.
Oh, that's a miracle.
That's a miracle, John?
Yes.
But let me ask you a question. Which of these two does that fall into?
Oh, number one.
No, number two.
Oh.
I say number two.
It is number two. That's true.
It is number two. And let me point out, hold on, I need to plug in the laptop. It is number two. And let me point out why. Okay? God performs miracles in two ways. For a meteorite to fall on this thug while he's about to shoot, he's literally has a finger on the trigger about to shoot her, is highly improbable and an extraordinary event, right? Which is like number two. But it's not inexplicable by scientific explanation. Meteorites do fall, right? It's just, so to speak, that the laws of improbability were suspended for this person, right? The laws of physics have not been suspended. The laws of probability have, I don't know if been suspended is the right word, but are working out in his favor, right? They haven't been suspended, but they're working out in his favor. Now, it turns out that most of our commentary agree, most of our sages throughout history agree that miracles can happen in two ways. Either by suspension, by the way, just to finish off the analogy, so imagine if the thug turned to stone in that second when he was about to shoot her, that would be the first type of miracle, right? Which is the laws of physics were suspended, and that's why, right? So two types of miracles. Now, the reason I'm so excited about how this thought experiment turned out is because Joanne's knee-jerk reaction, even though she realized eventually the error of her judgment here, her knee-jerk reaction was say, yeah, that's a miracle. Why? Because there is something miraculous about improbability. When something is extremely improbable and then it happens, there is something very miraculous about that happening. I'll point to often in discussions about the splitting of the Red Sea, right? So there are people that believe that it happened, and they have explanations for it, whatever. Well, actually, it turns out that it was a tsunami and a this and a that. And always, any manifest response to such a person is, okay, no problem, I'll give it to you. Let's say it's a tsunami, and it was the right wind and the right thing at the right time. There was an earthquake, and the whole thing happened, and the splitting of the sea. He says, but hold on a second. The probability of such a thing, which hasn't happened before that, at least as historically documented, okay, so maybe we don't have that much proof about that, but hasn't happened since then, certainly not. So for such a splitting of the Red Sea to happen of natural causes, and the likelihood of such a thing happening at the same time that a nation is at the precipice, right at the banks of the Red Sea, and there's an Egyptian army there about to kill them, and then they go through, and as soon as they go through it, the probability is very, very low, right? But essentially what happens then in such an argument is that the miracle shifts, right? So you're saying it's still miraculous, but it's not miraculous in that God suspended the laws of nature, but that God suspended or worked out the laws of nature in such a way that a completely improbable thing happened in order to benefit a particular nation or person, right? The Shem Shmuel, or Rabbi Shmuel Bornstein, who was a a distinguished Hasidic rabbi, Hasidic Rebbe, as they're called. He was a Rebbe of Kutsk. I'm sorry, he was a Rebbe of Sochachev. He was related to the Rebbes of Kutsk. Anyways, one of the Hasidic circles. In his book, the Avnei Nezer, in his book, the Shem Shmuel, he's more famously known for his work, the Avnei Nezer, so he's sometimes called Avnei Nezer. He clarifies these two levels of miracles. Joanne, you want to read for us, please? Text 5, page 187.
There are two kinds of governance. Oh, am I muted? No. Okay. There
You're
are two kinds of governance by which God leads his people Israel. There is an openly miraculous governance, as with manna, the well that sprang forth from a rock and provided Jews with water throughout their desert sojourn, and the clouds of glory that encompassed and protected the Jews in the desert. There's also governance that is clothed in nature, in which miracles are hidden. It is understood that as far as Israel is concerned, revealed miracles are preferable, more glorious and more splendid.
Hold on a second. I'm sorry for interrupting. I sometimes feel need to clarify something in the middle of reading. When Joanne is reading the word Israel, let me point out that this is from 5673, which is 18. I can't get the exact year here, but basically when he's saying Israel, he means like Yisrael, like the Jewish people. Okay, he's not talking about the land. Go ahead.
Okay. So it's understood that as far as Yisrael is concerned, revealed miracles are preferable, more glorious, more splendid, inasmuch as they elevate Israel's prestige and status among the nations. For God's sake, however, one could say that the miracles that are cloaked in natural phenomena are of greater benefit, for the miracles that are conveyed by a natural means elevate and purify the natural world.
So allow me to kind of link this like that you really get what we're talking about here. The Bible, the Torah, contains many stories that have miracles of biblical proportion all throughout Tanakh, right? That are God suspending the laws of nature. For by way of example, let's say the falling of the wall around Jericho, right? Everybody's familiar with the story. They go around with a shofar, the wall falls down, clearly a miracle where God suspended the laws of physics. Actually, I don't know if that's a perfect one because maybe it fell for a different reason, whatever, right? The manna falling in the desert is it. We'll take that one as an example. However, there are other ones which even Tanakh itself will describe as being a miracle that's enclosed within the ways of nature. The prime example of this is always the story of Purim. Right? We celebrate. There's a full holiday. We all agree it was miraculous. But actually, if you were living at the time of Purim and you were literally the most cynical atheist that ever existed, technically you could have described the whole thing as being perfectly natural. Esther's in the right place at the right time. Mordechai's in the right place at the right time. He saves the king's life. The king goes in a favor. Haman says the wrong thing at the wrong time. Achashverosh becomes very paranoid about Haman. All these things work out, and that's it. And yet we celebrate it as a miracle, right? The reason that's so important to recognize the difference between these two is because it's also important to understand who benefits from each one. Okay, in other words, who would rather each one? That's precisely what the Shem Shmuel is pointing out. Okay. A revealed miracle, okay, when a miracle suspends the laws of nature, there's no question that we as the Jewish people would love to have more miracles like that under our belts, right? Like I don't know, maybe we all like to believe at least that it would be more, we would be much more likely to believe in everything the Torah says if yesterday every Jew around the planet had been fired at with a weapon and the bullets had just turned around in mid ear and gone back at Jewish enemies. We'd be like, I have a miracle of biblical proportions that just happened yesterday. Of course I believe in God, right? So far as we're concerned, those make a greater impression on us and on the world about us, right? Why would any nation in the world want to start up on a nation that just, or want to wage war with a nation that just left Egypt with like 10 plagues that were uber miraculous, etc., right? However, from God's perspective, it's important to recognize that when he does that, he's breaking the laws of nature and he's kind of forcing godliness down on the world. And that wasn't the purpose of creation. The purpose of creation was that the physical world as the world was created, and here I'll give a little throwback for those of you that were at the course that we gave about Mashiach just recently, you'll recognize this idea, that God wants that he should be known to people who live in the physical world. In other words, what is more impressive? Lon Bender. What is more impressive? If you choose to believe in God right now, fully, 100% on board with it, because 3 minutes ago, you were sitting in this room and you had some sort of massive godly revelation. God literally reveals himself to you. Maybe he literally destroys the entire house around you and then builds the entire thing back up, and you're like, oh my God, I believe, right? Is that a stronger belief? Is that a more impressive belief in God? Or is more impressive belief in God if nothing happens? And you just, of your own volition, decide, you know what, God is true and I believe in him. To God, it's much more impressive if we can learn to believe in him in a more natural way. Because then
from a human perspective, a revealed miracle is necessary because humans I don't believe necessarily have the capacity as well without seeing the evidence, as they say,
precisely
in general.
But for precisely that reason, it's much more impressive if a human being does believe in God, from God's perspective. It's much more impressive if they believe in God because they've come to it than if they believe so because he made some sort of miracle, right?
That would be a purer way of coming to it, I think.
Purer way of coming. In other words, what I'm saying is like this: when are you more proud of your children? Right? Let's put this is the best way to put ourselves all in God's position. When are you more proud of your children? Right? I'll take my example with children my children's ages, right? If I see Menachem dancing around and hopping on one foot, I say, Menachem, do you need the potty? And he says, yeah, and he says, no, I don't need it. And I say, no, you really look like you do need the potty, right? And then I schlep him to the bathroom against his will, and then he's there, and it turns out he does need the potty, and everybody uses the bathroom. Now, there's no question. Afterwards, I tell him, Menachem, I'm so proud of you. You didn't have an accident, and you're going to get a treat because you used the potty, right? This is how we enforce potty training, right? But I'm sorry for giving examples of this situations that I'm in, but this is how old my children are. Am I more proud of him then for using the potty? Or if I'm upstairs with Bina and he's downstairs playing and I come downstairs and I'm looking at him like, where is he? And he's Tati, I'm in the bathroom. I said, what are you doing? He says, I needed to use the potty. So I went to the potty. And afterwards he comes out. Of course I give him a big hug and I say, I'm so proud of you. Here's a treat because you used the potty. Of course I'm much more proud of him that way. Right? So when God forces his presence down on us, I recognize now that was a very immature analogy, but I think it hopefully will drive the point home that I mean, it serves its purpose, that when God forces his presence down on us and then we acknowledge him, it's not as impressive for God. It doesn't give God as much nachas as if we come to it on our own. Yes, Mickey, you had raised your hand.
Well, I think to my mind, what you're talking about is faith, the whole concept of faith. And faith is not necessarily something that is logical or comes from just it can come out of a logical conclusions, in observing this or that or different things, but there is a leap. There's the expression leap of faith.
Right.
And I think that is that's a stronger and kind of rooted, much deeper roots to come to a belief from that place, as opposed to a miracle that you just witnessed that could have only come from God.
Perfect. Now, I don't want to get too deep into this because the point of this is just to point out that there's benefit to both miracles, that both miracles exist, and that even though one of them might look much more impressive so far as we're concerned, and the other one is like not as much of a miracle, but they both are miraculous to a certain degree. Now, when it comes to the 6-Day War, I think we're all in agreement that it doesn't belong to the first category of miracles, right? There was nothing that suspended the laws of physics. However, the reason why the front page of the Yediot Achronot and top commanders and many people since then point to the 6-Day War as being miraculous is because they believe it's a natural miracle. The laws of improbability were suspended or at least were bent to the favor of the Jewish people to a very, very strong degree. So what I want to do now is just take a few minutes, not too long, because we have to move on to the other three camps, to talk about some of the miracles, not just the general miracles there were, but some of the miracles that there were on the ground militarily during the 6-Day War. Mickey, can you read for us, please, text 6, which comes to us from one of the generals.
During the 1967 war, the Egyptian army's command and control system down to division and brigade level broke down. The seeds of this problem were planted in the 3 weeks before the outbreak of hostilities. Earlier in 1966, the Egyptians developed a new plan for the defense of the Sinai called Qahir, or the Victor. Plan Qahir placed control of combat forces in the Sinai under a field army commander directly responsible to GHQ, General Headquarters, in Cairo. But on the 15th of May, for reasons that still remain unclear, the Egyptian High Command surprised its senior officers with the sudden creation of a front command and the appointment of General Abed al-Mohsen Kamal Murtagi to head it. Murtagui, as the front commander, would be plagued by a number of problems. Although a competent soldier, he had been commanding the Egyptian expeditionary force in Yemen and lacked intimate knowledge of the operational plan for Sinai. Furthermore, as a front commander in Sinai, he would receive a high degree of responsibility without the commensurate authority to carry out his mission. Finally, Murtagui arrived at his command post in the Sinai near Bir al-Tamada on the 29th of May, only a week before the war, and with a small staff of 20 officers. The Egyptian command and control system was further undermined when the High Command replaced all 12 division commanders and chiefs of staff in the week or two after the creation of the Front Command. Then the confusion seeped down to brigades and lower.
This is, again, it's not the suspension of the laws of physics, but I don't know what explanation you could have for why the Egyptians would pull off such a dumb move immediately before such a mega war, that they should literally put a commander in charge who doesn't know the terrain. And we all know that in war, one of the biggest factors is what we call in the sports world home field advantage, right? If you're fighting on your terrain, right, you have a huge advantage over. And to take that away from yourself by switching up the commander and all the leading officers, etc., is ridiculous. You know, Shaiki Gavish was the general of Israel's Southern Command. He was fighting during the 6th Day War. He was directing the divisions that were to conquer the Sinai. And he testifies as follows. I'll read for you. He says, "We did not know that the Egyptians changed all of the division commanders. This provided us with a huge advantage. We effectively went to battle against 8 to 10 division commanders who were not familiar with the terrain. Moreover, the commander of the entire front had just come from Yemen and was not familiar with the Sinai Peninsula." Right? This is what leads people to say that the victory was miraculous. As we know, Israel scored a breathtaking victory in the Sinai. The Egyptian division stationed there 100,000 troops, 950 tanks, 1,100 armored personnel carrier, and more than 1,000 artillery pieces, posed very little resistance to the few Jewish soldiers which had come. And the result is eerily reminiscent of a blessing that Hashem gives us in the books of Vayikra and Devarim, text 7a and 7b. Alon, can you read for us, please?
Here we go. "You will pursue your enemies, and they will fall before you by sword. 5 of you will pursue 100 of your foe, and 100 of you will pursue 10,000. From Leviticus and from Deuteronomy, God will cause your enemies who rise up against you to be defeated before you. They will come out against you from one direction, but they will flee from you in 7 directions."
This is literally what happened on the Sinai front. Okay. Another point. So here on the slide, I'm trying to be on top of the slides so that we have them at the right time. Number 1 is, in the Sinai desert, the commanders who were unfamiliar with the terrain. Number 2 is on the Egyptian airfields. Okay, so we've already elaborated in lesson 2 that the war was virtually won in the first few hours, right, because of the airfield strikes that the Israeli forces, or whatever, the preemptive airfield strikes that the Israelis did. I forgot the more sophisticated word that I was going to say from my head.
Initiated.
There we go. Thank you. So here's the question: why were the Egyptians such easy targets? Michael Oren explains back to the book 6 Days of War in text 8. Where are we holding here? Lon just read. So Joanne, why don't you read for us? Text 8, please.
Supplied by Britain, Jordan's radar facility at Ajlun near Jerash was one of the most sophisticated in the Middle East. At 8:15 a.m., the station's screens were suddenly studded with blips. Though the Jordanians had grown accustomed to large numbers of Israeli aircraft heading out to sea, The density of the concentration was unprecedented. The officer on duty radioed in Grape, Inab, in Arabic, the prearranged code word for war, to Jordanian General Riyad's headquarters in Amman. Riyadh in turn relayed the information to Egyptian Defense Minister Shams Badran in Cairo, and there it remained, undecipherable. The Egyptians had changed their encoding frequencies the previous day, but without updating the Jordanians. Egyptian Air Force intelligence also reported extensively on the Israeli attack, but the officers at Supreme Headquarters devoted to Field Marshal Abdel Hakim, Amir and distrustful of Nasser's loyalists in the Air Force, ignored them.
I mean, again, is it possible that it's just a probability and we got lucky and the right time they switched it? They pulled off a really dumb move and changed their codes. The whole thing, it's not dumb. Dumb is the wrong word. The word I would use is miraculous. Why would you change your codes? You're communicating with a couple other nations and you're supposed to be having each other's back, etc. Right? And why would you do that? So again, this will conclude. Right? We're not going to say, my point is not to bring exhaustive proofs to the fact that the war was miraculous. I subscribe to this view that the victory was miraculous. And here you have some things which people who subscribe to this camp will point out to you and say, look, the miracle wasn't, the war wasn't a miracle where God suspended the laws of nature, but it was one where within nature, you could see God's fingerprints all over it. A whole bunch of things, like at the key moments, the right things were happening to literally skew the entire war in Israel's favor. Okay. So that is on one end of the spectrum, miraculous. On the other, so faced with cognitive dissonance of Israel winning a spectacular war when they've had tremendous expectations to fail, comes the solution. It was a miracle. It actually, so that solves the whole cognitive dissonance right there. But that's only camp number one. A second theory is that actually was unmiraculous. And this is based on a fairly simple thing. Listen, all of the dire predictions were based on one point. And the dire predictions were based on all of the threats from the Arab nations, right? The Arab nations were all, I mean, that wasn't the only thing it was based on, it was also based on intelligence that they had, but a lot of it was based on what a cynic can tell you are exaggerated and fear-mongering reports or announcements that are coming from Egypt and from Jordan and from Lebanon, etc. So I think this is particularly what Joanne and Lon were saying before we started, which is that the victory was due to Israel's superior intelligence and military preparedness, and Israel was much more prepared than they realized, but Israel fell victim to just a lot of bravado on behalf of the Arab nations. Michael Oren, back in 6 Days of War, I'm sorry, not in 6 Days of War. I'm trying to lead up to text 9. So let's just read it. In text 9, Steve Lind talks about, Michael Oren points out that this has much more recently, this has become a much more popular perspective. It's become much more of a pervasive perspective. In other words, after the war, many more people were more comfortable saying it was a miracle. I guess as more information came out and people found ways to rationalize it, this has become a more pervasive attitude. Let's see text 9. Where are we here? I think Mickey. I can't keep track here, but Mickey, if you can please read for us text 9.
Sure. This is from Steve Lindy.
This is from a very recent look. I want you to pay attention to the fact this is an article in the Jerusalem Post from 2007. This is not 1967 at all, right? This is 40 years later.
The biggest myth going is how somehow there was not a real and immediate Arab threat, that somehow Israel could have negotiated itself outside the crisis of 1967, and that it wasn't facing an existential threat or facing any threat at all, said Michael Oren, who is a senior fellow at the Adelson Institute for Strategic Studies at Jerusalem's Shalom Center and the author of 6 Days of War, June 1967. He noted that this was the premise of Tom Segev's book, 1967, Israel, the War, and the Year That Transformed the Middle East. Quote, "What's remarkable is that all the people alleging this, not one of them is working from Arabic sources. It's quite extraordinary when you think about it. It's almost as if Israel were living in a universe by itself. It's deeply solipsistic. It's a deeply solipsistic approach to Middle East history." What's behind the myth, Oren argued, is, quote, "a more pervasive, ongoing effort to show that Israel bears the bulk, if not the sole responsibility, for decades of conflict in the Arab world, and that the Arabs are the aggravated party. It's an attempt to show that Israel basically planned the 6-day war in advance, knowing that it was going to expand territorially. My position is that it was just the opposite. Israel was taken aback by the crisis, unprepared for it, and panicked, believing it faced a true existential threat, and did not plan to expand territory. Quote, "It did everything it could to keep Jordan and Syria out of the war. My reading of the Arabic documents show that the Arabs had real plans to attack and destroy the state of Israel."
Thank you. So Michael Oren and Tom Segev and Steve Lind are making the case, at least at the very extreme end, that usually if somebody has an approach that they take like a very like atheistic approach, and they say the whole thing was natural. In fact, Israel knew they were going to win the war. They just pretended because they wanted to expand more. They're taking the approach that basically a perspective like this is built on an assumption or built on preconceived values that you have. So you're A, atheistic, B, you're anti-Israel, C, you only read Israel documents, which means you come at it from a very solipsistic, means more is like extreme egocentrism, where you look at it only from Israel's perspective. You don't bother looking at what was actually the facts on the grounds and what the Arabs were actually doing. And you say that Israel actually had a very militarily capable thing. And even the 10,000 graves that they dug was all just a show, right? And again, their point is, these authors, their point is to show that the only way that somebody really comes to this approach is if you have an agenda to begin with. You're here because you want to blame Israel. You're here because you want to. So therefore, you start off that way. Now, I want to point out that's the very extreme side of this camp. A person could choose to just take a much simpler perspective and say, you don't have to go all conspiracy theory on me and say that the Israelis knew that they were going to win the war, just they pretended like they were going to lose, etc. No, you could just say that the Israelis actually were more prepared than the Arabs. They just didn't know it. In my view, is a little bit of a stretch because look, the Arabs were very, very prepared. They had very, very large armies. Okay, but I could see somebody saying they had large armies, but, like Israel had better tactics and better intelligence, etc., plus preemptive strikes, etc. And you definitely need to add into the mix here that there was a lot of exaggerated fear mongering going on the part of the Arabs, which maybe led the Israelis to believe that they were in the underdog position, but that they actually weren't in the underdog position. Okay, so that's another way of resolving this cognitive dissonance. You're going to run into a lot of problems, but it's one way of looking at it and saying that's why there was an expectation that we're going to lose, and a stunning victory in the end. Okay. An important note: we're now going to go to the third camp, which I saw already on some of your faces, even as I introduced them at the beginning. This makes a lot of people very uncomfortable. The reason we're spending some time and talking about religious anti-Zionism, okay? So by religious anti-Zionism, I mean it's a general group, but mostly it's made up of the Satmar Hasidim, and most notably the Neturei Karta, which is like the most extreme of the Satmar Hasidim. Some of you are familiar with what I'm talking about. The reason I'm taking some time today to give them some airtime and to explain this is because, first of all, I want to give all the perspectives. I want to give a full picture. I believe that I'm not leaving anybody out here. We just took care of most people when we said either miraculous or totally naturally explainable. But it's important to explain their perspective for a few reasons. First of all, I think we get a full picture. Second, I think more important because if we want to not just disagree with people, but understand where they're coming from, then we have to be willing to understand even people with whom we strongly disagree with or whose views make us uncomfortable. In order for us to provide that mutual respect as a foundation to actually be able to move forward. Okay, so that's kind of part of the reason why I'm doing it. Now, I'm going to take some time right afterwards to talk about how Chabad is diametrically opposed to this view, and I'll explain a little bit why. But I'm going to present it in all of its glory now. Okay, and maybe halfway through I'll get too uncomfortable, and I won't. But I'm going to attempt to. Okay, so last week I alluded to this a little bit. It's built on a prohibition, an avera, that there is in the Torah, transgression that there is in the Torah, one of the 365 negative commandments that there is in the Torah, which is called Shelo Yalu Yisrael B'choma. Right, that's so, and I want to remind you, even though I know you're all perfectly academically sound people, I just want to remind you that just because somebody bases something on the Torah, right, doesn't mean that that is the Torah's perspective, okay? But there is a transgression in the Torah, which goes as follows in text 10. Lana, I'll ask you to read it for us, please. It's an issur, a prohibition against taking the land by force. Go ahead.
I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, that you neither awaken nor arouse the love until it is desirous. And then in the second one, it's saying, in this verse, God imposes an oath upon the Jews that they not retake the land of Israel by force.
So this quote that we just had is from the Talmud. The Talmud is describing the basis or the origin of an issur, which is called Shelo Yalu B'choma, that you're not allowed to take the land by force. Now, religious anti-Zionists, right? In other words, religious opposition to the state of Israel, to the modern state of Israel. Remember, they're not against the land of Israel belonging to the Jewish people. They still agree with that. It says that in the Torah. But the religious opposition to the modern state of Israel is founded on this transgression, and they say that therefore we are totally anti-Zionist. We're anti the establishment of the state of Israel. We don't think that's what the Torah wants from us. It was started by a whole bunch of secular and God-loathing people who all they wanted to do was go against the Torah. And therefore, from day one in 1948, they were against this whole movement. Now, in addition to the technical, and this is where things start to get very blurry, we have to really pay attention here, okay? In addition to the technicality that they have to as a basis for their movement, they then go on to add more, historical or historical validity to their claim that this whole religious Zionism is a terrible, that this whole Israeli Zionism movement, the whole Zionist movement, is a terrible thing for Judaism. Why? For this, a little bit of history is important. In the 1800s, in the wake of the Enlightenment movement, right, or the Enlightenment and its newly afforded freedoms, European Jews all of a sudden found themselves able to attend universities, build professional careers without discrimination. Right? I'm talking about Germany, Austria, Eastern Europe in the 1800s. France, yeah, certainly France, exactly. Now, so besides for the freedoms that Jews were all of a sudden being afforded, in addition to that, there was this emancipation of the spirit movement, which many Jews subscribed to. By the way, this wasn't just something that a few Jews subscribed to. This was a movement of Jews which believed that all of a sudden, these archaic laws, Shulchan Aruch, the Jewish code of law, the Torah, right, all of these things, which we had put in place only in order to keep ourselves separate from the nations of the world and to make sure that we had a way to live during exile, now all of a sudden have no place. We don't need a Shulchan Aruch anymore. We don't need a code of Jewish law, etc. Now, there was one problem flying in the face of all of this. What was that? That whereas perhaps before all this European emancipation and enlightenment and freedoms that European Jews all of a sudden faced, people could have said that was the cause of anti-Semitism. They don't know enough about us, they haven't seen us, etc., all sorts of things like that. The problem was that despite all of these freedoms, anti-Semitism seemed to still persist. And that's where the solution to this came, right? We could call it another cognitive dissonance that arose out of this, and that was Zionism. And by the way, a central pillar of the Zionist doctrine was, you go back to the 1800s, 1900s, and you take a look at the Zionist doctrines, you see this very, very much featured. It was Kichola Goyim Beit Yisrael, to be a nation like all other nations. That's what the pioneering Zionists, that's what they dreamed of. In other words, we're going to move to Israel. We're going to be a nation, and we're going to be a nation that's just going to have a nationalistic approach to their country, just like anyone else. And everything else about Judaism disappears. And there was actually a movement to exclude religious Jews from making Aliyah in a pre-establishment of the state of Israel, a state, so that it shouldn't have a religious vibe. In their view, nationalism was the new religion. Zionism is the new religion, and that should replace anything else that we have. To illustrate this point, I want you to consider the following text, and Mickey, I'll ask you to read it for us, please. Which is made by some of the early leaders of the Zionist movement. Please read for us text 11a. This is Max Mandelstam.
I have concluded that those Jews who are not Zionists, at least in their minds and hearts, are not Jews. To be a Zionist is to be a Jew. There are many citizens of the world who are considered Jewish, who observe the commandments such as circumcision, tzitzit, and tefillin, who are scrupulous regarding ritual slaughter, pray at the proper times, and fast on Jewish fast days. But in a national sense, these people have the right to the title Jew as much as I can rightly identify myself as Chinese, were I to choose to abide by Chinese law.
This is a very interesting perspective. He's saying if you're not a Zionist, you're not a Jew. I don't care how much Torah mitzvahs you're keeping. Now, here's what I want to remind you. Max Mandelstam, who's a Zionist activist, is born in Lithuania, and he lives in Ukraine. And this is in the 1800s. So this is way before the establishment of the state of Israel. It's a dream. Right now, it's a dream. But he believes, in my perspective, Judaism is about Zionism and nothing else plays any role in this. You wear tzitzit, that's a beautiful thing. You can be not Jewish and wear tzitzit, but that doesn't make you Jewish. Jewish is if you're a Zionist. Text 11b, Joanne, once we have you guys right there, is Nachman Sirkin, a political theorist and writer, again, 1800s, early 1900s. Go for it. Tsarist Russia he's born in, right? But he's a Zionist and a socialist.
This new Zionist Judaism stands in complete contrast to the Judaism of the medieval ages, religious Judaism, exilic Judaism. In fact, Zionism uproots religious Judaism in a stronger and more fundamental manner than does the Reform movement and assimilation. These uprooted Judaism in an artificial way, causing complete assimilation or allowing for the reemergence of Talmudic and religious Judaism in a later period. Zionism, on the other hand, fundamentally uproots Judaism by creating new standards of Judaism and creating new Jewish spiritual values. This will successfully eradicate religious Judaism to the point that it will never again reemerge.
Powerful stuff. No, almost sounds like written by an anti-Semite. This is written by a strong, ardent Zionist. Now, lest you think, by the way, that this is just hold on. Lest you think that this is just theoretical Zionist back at the time. David Ben Gurion said similar. I'll quote David Ben Gurion. The Shulchan Aruch, the Jewish Code of Law, is a product of our nation's life in the exile. It was produced in the exile, in conditions of exile. A nation in the process of fulfilling its every task physically and spiritually must compose a new Shulchan. And our nation's intellectuals are required, in my opinion, to fulfill their responsibility in this. He believed there has to be a new Shulchan Aruch that has to be established, which would have Zionism as its core and central theme. So, to remind you, we're trying to understand where religious anti-Zionists come from. Not that they necessarily are drawing the right conclusions. And we'll get to that in a moment. So number one, they start with the Talmud that says there's a prohibition. You're not allowed to retake the land of Israel by force. Then they say, let's look at the ruach, the spirit of Zionism. Max Mandelstam says to be a Zionist is to be a Jew. Completely antithetical to Torah. Nachman Sirkin says Zionism uproots religious Judaism. David Ben Gurion says we must compose a new Shulchan Aruch. By the way, I think the reason they don't quote this is because I think he regretted it and took it back later. But Theodor Herzl, I believe, was quoted as at one point while he was going through a depression of some sort, and he immediately retracted the statement. But just that it could come from him, I think, shows on something that at one point he toyed with the idea that Israel should start, all of the Jews should go to Israel, but we should all convert to Christianity in the process.
Really?
Because part of what's causing anti-Semitism, remember, Zionism is supposed to be a solution. You can look this up. He took it back very quickly, retracted very quickly. But just that somebody can even think such a thing shows that Zionism takes like a very strong place, way more than your Judaism. If you think about it rationally and logically, though, it kind of works. Like if Zionism is supposed to be a solution to anti-Semitism, I'm willing to, and the ultimate solution to anti-Semitism, I'm willing to let go of everything. I can make the state of Israel be in Uganda, right? I can make all Jews convert to Christianity, as long as it eliminates this big bug called anti-Semitism, which, by the way, if you pay attention, right, like meaning through hindsight, the state of Israel didn't solve anti-Semitism, right? In fact, it can even be claimed that it exacerbated it. So maybe he was right. Maybe in order to get rid of anti-Semitism, Zionism wasn't enough. Maybe they needed some other things as well. So now, if you're a religious anti-Zionist, or from this vantage, you look at it like, whoa, Zionism is the new Christianity, right? They took Judaism. It's based off Judaism. It's a whole bunch of Jews starting it, but they're taking it in a whole different direction. Everything that I know and love about Judaism, that I believe that's important about Judaism, is now disappearing because of this new thing called Zionism. So at this backdrop, I think it's understandable that some religious Jews felt that the anti-religious agenda of the state rendered it as an enterprise that's treif. You know, it's like totally, there's no way there can be an expression of God's will. So how do they solve so how do they solve the cognitive dissonance of, we felt this whole experiment that's going on in Israel from 1948 to 1967 was not sanctioned by God, not the right thing. And now we see what seems to be almost a miracle, right? And it's a crazy, I mean, why would God support this treifah state of Israel and give them such a victory? Even though I don't like reading this, you know what, let's not read it. I prefer not to read text 12. If you don't mind, it makes me extremely uncomfortable. You're all welcome to read it on your own if you'd like to. Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum or Yerush Teitelbaum is the Satmar Rebbe. And he basically subscribes to the view that the whole 6-day war was an act of the Satan, so to speak, like negative forces, evil forces in the world, which, okay, we could talk about why philosophically evil forces exist, but basically this is evil at its height. That's why the Israelis won the 6-day war. And it was essentially enforcing something which is terrible. Now,
do you want to go to 13? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm going to move on to 13 if you don't mind. But before we do that, I do want to take a few minutes just to talk, and now I'm going to clarify this as the Chabad perspective and why Chabad doesn't agree with this. I'm sure many of you have reasons why you find religious anti-Zionism to be extremely uncomfortable, and it's probably not just because the Neturei Karta goes to Iran to meet with their leadership, or that they stand outside AIPAC together with pro-Palestinian demonstrators and demonstrate against Israel, etc. I'm sure we all have reasons why. In my perspective, there's a few things here. First of all, and by the way, I'll add that I think this is why most religious Jews, the majority of religious Jews, are not anti-Zionist. I don't know that they all consider themselves ardent Zionists and they agree with everything, but I think this is why. For starters, it's possible for two things to be true at the same time. It's possible for Israel to be the establishment of the state of Israel to be a good thing for Jews while simultaneously being a bad thing. It's possible for it to be something that God likes while at the same time something that God doesn't like. And it's possible to support it in certain ways, not support it in other ways. In other words, you can be a strong supporter of Jews living in Israel because of the holiness of the land of Israel. You can be a strong supporter in Jews living in Israel and being religious, right? Because if those are your views, that religion is a strong part of Judaism, then you can believe that that's important and part of it. And at the same time oppose certain government policies, for instance, that are anti-religious, right? And at the same time oppose certain parts of the state of Israel that you disagree with. I think possibly even more important, maybe not, I don't know, maybe equally as important, is also a huge issue that I have with this, which is, last week we spoke about the paramount importance that Judaism places on pikuach nefesh, which means human life. Certainly, as Jews, we should be very concerned about Jewish life. And even if, let's say, you decide, for whatever reason, that the whole state of Israel is treif, and the whole thing is a bad experiment. And if I was in charge of the whole Judaism, I would disband the entire state of Israel, etc. You cannot take away the fact that there are millions today already, a majority of Jews living in the land of Israel, at least 50% of Jews living in the land of Israel. And as a result, just pikuach nefesh alone should make you support 100% the IDF, whose mission statement it is to protect the Jews in the land of Israel. If you're religious, then that means that you believe that first of all, you believe there's a mitzvah of to love your fellow as yourself, but then you also believe that as Hillel says, it's the fundamental upon which the entire Torah is built. So you got a problem if you're not only not going to support them, but you're going to support opposing views, which means essentially you're supporting the murder of 50% of the Jewish people. So while maybe theoretically this whole thing works out in your brain, it doesn't always work that way. That's not how life always works. It's not always about theories and fundamentals, as we see even in Judaism, right? Just because Judaism believes we should keep Shabbat doesn't mean we always keep Shabbat. Every once in a while, when somebody's life is on the line, we don't keep Shabbat because we believe that human life is even more important. So it's about priorities. So that's another thing that I would add to it. Moreover, I'll add one more element here. I personally believe that anti-religious, the whole anti-religious agenda is a tragedy in Israel, and yet I can still strongly support Jews in the land of Israel. There's a very strong anti-religious agenda in many levels of government in Israel, right? I think that's a tragedy. I think if Jews are living in a land, then that land should be a Jewish land. But I think probably the nail on the head here is, if you're a Jew, you believe that God runs the world. And if you believe that God runs the world, you believe that the establishment of the state of Israel, as much as we maybe wouldn't have wanted it to happen because of the people who were making it happen, etc., but it's God's will. And if it's God's will, and maybe if just because beforehand you wouldn't have supported it because of some of the theologies associated with it, after the fact that it happened, that's the fact on the ground. You don't get to control whether Jews do or don't live in the land of Israel, or whether the state of Israel does or doesn't exist. That's fact now. And we believe that was ordained by God. And that's a huge deal. So to summarize, I want to point out that actually, if you look at Chabad theology, there's a huge shift in Chabad theology when it comes to Zionism before 1948 and after 1948, which in Chabad ideology is mainly marked by the Rebbe becoming Rebbe. You can read some statements from the previous Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab, who was before him, and look at them and you go, whoa, were they Satmar or something? Right? The strong words that they have against the state of Israel. And then you have to remind yourself, the state of Israel wasn't established. They were anti a movement which was anti-Judaism, anti-religious. Of course, they're going to be ardently opposed to that, right? Now, there was also a religious Zionist movement. We can talk about that in a moment. But then you notice that the Rebbe has simultaneously a couple things going on. Number one, I mean, I don't know if you could find a stronger supporter of Israel than the Rebbe. And I mean that even including the people on this Zoom. The Rebbe would meet with military commanders and with politicians of Israel and influenced Israeli policy and Israeli governance on a tremendous level. On a tremendous level. I mean, there's first-hand accounts, there's interviews of people, prime ministers, Begin and Sharon and Perez, and all of them meeting or having messengers that met with the Rebbe and every step of the way, consulting almost with the Rebbe. Yet at the same time, I will point out that the Rebbe never called the establishment of the state of Israel by the establishment of the state of Israel. The Rebbe would always call that time a Ma'aseh Tavshin Ches, whatever it is that happened in 1948. And in my view, one of the reasons for that is because from a certain perspective, what happened in 1948 was a tremendous calamity for Judaism. There all of a sudden was now a movement. Okay, I hope I don't lose any of you here, but there was a movement of people who believed that Zionism was the new Judaism, and that this Jewish state should be on the forefront of assimilation, at the forefront of eroding the Jewish religion from the Jewish people. To me, that's a tragedy. Are there certain parts of it that are a gift to the Jewish people? Absolutely. But I'm trying to give you the other side. So I hope that what I've presented now is, first of all, the religious anti-Zionist movement, and why they would come to the conclusion that this was Ma'aseh Satan. I hope I've also made it clear that I strongly disagree with that. The Chabad perspective strongly disagrees with that, and hopefully I'll give you some clarity as to why most Jews disagree with that. But at the same time, we have a little bit of an appreciation where they come from, that maybe some of the values that their movement, which is very, very much mistaken, is based on, could have some validity to them. Everybody with me here? You're all very quiet. What do you think, Joanne?
Well, first of all, you talk too fast. So
Okay.
sometimes I don't catch everything you're saying.
Okay.
It goes by so fast that I miss some of the points. But anyway, it was interesting the comment that the anti-Zionist movement, that the anti-Zionism was among Jews was against the divorcing Judaism from Zionism, if you will. I mean, it was like not, taking the religion out of the religion. I mean, out of the people. It's kind of hard to do that, huh?
Right.
It's like you're going to be Jewish, but not be Jewish somehow. I don't know.
He wants to redefine Judaism. Look, clearly the Jewish people as a whole weren't on board with it because Israel is a democratic state and a lot of it happens by vote. So clearly, and by the way, the debate is still out, right? Israel has a lot. That's the biggest politics in Israel is between the Haredi and the Chiloni, right? Between the religion and that. So clearly, what they intended to be an agenda for all of the Jewish people was not something all of the Jewish people were on board, right? At the very least, you have to say it's 50-50, if not more, right? But that was their view. And I could see why people would be opposed to that. Lon, what do you have to say? You sound like you're itching to say something. You look like you're itching to say something.
I just concur that it is a classical situation of replacement theology coming from a government organization.
Right, and you could see,
and that the Judaism itself is the spiritual aspects of Judaism itself is imperative to be a Jew.
It can't be removed. But so let me ask you a question. I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that you're not a religious anti-Zionist. Okay, but do you feel like you can understand a little bit more where they come from?
I can, because it explains the perspective that that the Zionism is a replacement theology.
Okay, we're going over time here. And that's fine. I want to talk about religious Zionism. I mentioned I would talk about that, and that's the fourth camp. Religious Zionism is a movement that believes that the state of Israel not only should exist, and obviously exist in a religious manner, but that going to Israel is actually our job now. That's what we need to do. So before we get there, by the way, this is a group of people that to date I think mainly dominated is the Mizrahi Jews, right? Everybody familiar with the Mizrahi Jews that there are in Israel? They're like the main. Shoot! I forgot to say. I lost my train of thought here. Because let me back up here. To wrap up the third camp, right? So remember, we have three camps here. Camp number one that solves the cognitive dissonance by saying that it was the war was a miracle. The victory was a miracle. Camp number two is that says that the whole thing is explainable and there's nothing to do with God. The whole thing is explainable by natural means. Camp number three, the religious anti-Zionists, another reason why they're wrong, just to address the actual mitzvah of the fact that we're not allowed to conquer the land of Israel, that actually does not apply today. The reason it doesn't apply today is because of the fact that all the Jews live there. So I mentioned that idea, but I didn't directly address the transgression of Shelo Ya'adu V'choma, which means that we shouldn't actively conquer the land of Israel by force. It doesn't apply when you have millions of Jews there that are living there. We have to defend ourselves. That's not even a question. Okay, so to review, camp number one, divine intervention. Camp number two, logical explanation, exaggeration and fear mongering. Camp number three, intercession by unholy powers. That's how they solve the cognitive dissonance. And now we get to camp number three, religious Zionism. Religious Zionism is a very, very large group of Jews, mainly dominated by the Mizrahi Jews. They view the establishment of the state of Israel and every war that has happened since then as miracles and evidence to the fact that we are actually on the right track. This is what we're supposed to be doing as Jews, which means Aschalta de Geula means the onset of redemption. Now, a lot of you are going to take issue with this right away because you were at the course about Mashiach, and you know that this is not how Mashiach plays out. It doesn't start by us conquering the land of Israel. Hashem gives us the land of Israel, and then we make Aliyah, and then we come. as a follow-up to that, and we could talk about why this is completely unsupported from a halachic perspective, from Maimonides' perspective. But they, therefore, obviously, when it comes to the 6-day war, their perspective is this is a miracle and it's a significant stage in Mashiach coming to reality. Okay, the Mizrahi Jews are led by the rabbis Rab Kook. And text 13, Lon, you were going to read it for us, is in a nutshell the way they view the war.
This is not a coincidental shaping of history. Rather, we must see God's guiding hand and his divine ordering of events for what they are. The fulfillment of, quote, when the Lord brings back the captivity of Zion from Psalms. How fortunate are we to be part of this national rebirth? All of the wars we've experienced have been a part of the process of redemption. Whether they occurred before or after the establishment of the state, whether they were before or after the conquest of Jerusalem, we are in the middle of the journey. God causes salvation to appear and brings redemption to completion, step by step.
And to them, to Rabbi Kook, yeah, and to Rabbi Kook and his followers, secular Zionists, they're just unwitting participants in God's master plan. God can do whatever he needs to, right? So they were involved in the establishment of the state of Israel, even though God obviously doesn't want the state of Israel to be secular, right? Now, I want to point out that these people are usually also what most of the world calls right-wing extremists. They're usually the ones who believe in settling every iota of the land. They believe in the most extreme among them believe in killing Palestinians, and they believe in pushing everyone else out of the land because this is us bringing about Mashiach. The reason why most religious Jews don't agree with this camp, in other words, they're a big movement, but they're not by any stretch of the imagination the majority. The reason why the majority of religious Jews do not agree with this movement is because Mashiach in halacha, in other words, in Jewish law, as it's described by Maimonides in his book, for instance, has a process that it follows. And the process that it follows is that Mashiach comes first, and then we all go to the land of Israel. So while this may be, how this is part of God's plan, we don't know, right? And maybe it's part of that plan, it's certainly not the beginning of Mashiach coming, and we have no obligation, none of the obligations that we have when Mashiach comes are in effect yet, according to Jewish law. So that is a fourth camp. Okay. I promised you a treat at the end, and here's where I get to be a Chabadnik in all my glory, and I get to trumpet the Rebbe as an amazing individual, because the one person, I think I'm pretty comfortable saying this, the one human being on the planet who, instead of struggling with a cognitive dissonance afterwards, never had cognitive dissonance to begin with, was the Rebbe. And I want to point something out. The Rebbe, this is so cool because you can see this historically. There is not a single individual, and I tell you this as a person in a position of leadership. As a person in a position of leadership, one of the things I'm most careful about is that if I am unsure about something, I don't present myself as if I'm 100% sure of the outcome. It's the worst thing I can do. Because what's going to happen to me then is everybody comes with kindness, everybody comes afterwards with like, hey, how come you said this, you said that, you were so sure about it, you were clearly wrong. And I don't want that kind of, right? So I have to first be 100% sure about something, then I can then, profess that and explain that and say that to people. And yet that is exactly the perspective the Rebbe took against the tide of the entire world, not after the 6-day war, but before the 6-day war. To the Rebbe, there was no cognitive dissonance. Before the war, he expected a miraculous victory with very few casualties, and that's exactly what happened. I want you to turn your attention to the video screens. Some of it is text 14. We're going to skip text 14 because you're going to hear it from the Rebbe himself. This is one of the coolest things, is that this is 1967. So there's video evidence, there's everything. So let's take it. So please turn your attention to the video screens.
May 28, 1967, was a day of 3 pivotal speeches. In Cairo, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser held an international press conference. In Tel Aviv, Israeli Prime Minister Eshkol spoke to the people of Israel. And in New York, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, addressed world Jewry. Each of these messages attracted extreme attention. After all, it was only 8 days before the Middle East would be plunged into war. Before hundreds of the world's press, Nasser unabashedly broadcast Egypt's intentions. The existence of Israel is in itself an aggression. We will not accept any coexistence with Israel. The war with Israel is in effect since 1948. In plain words, the Arab armies led by Egypt intended to wipe Israel off the map. This was not an empty threat. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan were mobilizing vast armies on Israel's border and broadcasting the same intentions. On the same day, Prime Minister Eshkol delivered a message over the waves of Israel's national radio station Kol Yisrael. While Nasser had spent weeks rallying the Middle East to a combined military onslaught against an isolated Israel, Eshkol had maintained an ominous silence since the start of the crisis. He now decided to reassure the jittery public that the IDF was adequately prepared to defend itself and that Israel was navigating a diplomatic resolution through international channels. Neither was fully true. The military intelligence and civilian leaderships all predicted impending disaster. The Israeli public was already bracing itself for the most horrifying possibilities. Eshkol stumbled nervously, and Israel trembled. Shimon Peres later described the effect of Eshkol's fumbled address.
Eshkol's radio speech was simply traumatic. In retrospect, one could probably say that the public overreacted. But at the time, when you didn't know what is going to happen, and the whole world is applauding Nasser, at a time when we lost our self-confidence, and the worst doubts were voiced, the impression it created was of doubt and fear.
An Israeli colonel wrote, "With his stuttering, he conveyed more insecurity and confusion. I heard that soldiers at the front burst out crying." An already alarmed Israel was thrown into panic. That same day, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, head of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, and a revered spiritual leader of world Jewry, delivered a public address that was broadcast around the globe, including a simultaneous translation from Yiddish to Hebrew on Israel's Kol Yisrael radio station that Eshkol had used only hours earlier. It was Lag BaOmer, a day of great rejoicing and mystical significance in the Jewish calendar. This year, though, Jewish hearts worldwide winced in worry over the existential threat that hung over the Jews of Israel. They had reason to fear, for it was now the Sunday before the outbreak of war. The Rebbe had called for a grand Lag BaOmer Jewish Children's Parade to publicly express Jewish pride and to encourage Torah observance. 20,000 Jewish school children from across America heeded the call, gathering with their parents and educators in the giant leaf-lined boulevard facing the Rebbe's headquarters in Brooklyn, New York. The Rebbe personally addressed the rally, but his forceful prediction took the world by surprise.
Was eure Brüder und Schwestern, was gefühlen sich in Eretz Akedesh in Eretz Israel, stehen nicht in einem Lager, wo der Rebeste beschützt sie und schickt sie seine Brüche und Atzloche in Yeshua in ein vergrößerter Moss, gedei sie sollen rauskommen und sie wollen rauskommen von dem ichtigen Masse mit Atzloche und damit ist das Mekuye. Das, was wir haben gelernt in den sederen Nächten, als wir schafften, das Wetter bejahtzigen, als sie in Eretz Israel werden sitzen dort sicher, wenn man sagt, die Scholem behoret, aber der Oberste wird Mamschir sein, also sei Scholem in Eretz Agdesha, והאיסי לכם לא לקים, וסרצי הריספידן, בידי המויה הפסוכה הקדושה והרחובה, für sein breitere, offener und voller Hand, von allen Schwierigkeiten über zu bringen, in Schulen und Bettach, in allem, in was nötig ist, und bekoren Mamos.
A singular voice of optimism in a universe of despair. The Rebbe's words electrified the Israeli public. Newspapers across Israel, regardless of affiliation, from Haaretz to Al HaMishmar, converted the Rebbe's astonishing message into headlines of hope. God is watching over the Holy Land, and salvation is near, cried the headlines of Yediot Achronot, an Israeli daily. The prediction seemed so utterly at odds with that of Israel's own leadership and the grim reality growing ever more dense around Israel's borders, just 8 days shy of the Six-Day War.
This was not something that the Rebbe only reserved for a public address. This was something the Rebbe gave in personal advice. Raise your hands if you've heard of Schwartzy. Adrienne, I know you for sure. Anyone else? Rabbi Schwartz was a rabbi during the 60s. I'm sorry, a little later, probably late 60s, 70s. But in 1967, he was a rabbi here in Los Angeles. That's why I asked him. I knows him. He was a Chabad rabbi. Very not traditional. But in 1967, he, along with 3 other students, were yeshiva students in Israel. They wrote to the Rebbe asking if they should leave. The Rebbe's response is the beginning of text 15. Ives, Langsam, Rodel, and Schwartz, Yeshivas Torah Emes, they were in Jerusalem. They were literally in yeshiva in Jerusalem. The Rebbe writes them in response to your telegram. You can see this, guys. It's on page 200. Continue your Torah study with complete dedication, along with all the other students, without any shadow of a doubt. The guardian of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. We share good news. Another big one was Rabbi Moshe Pinchas Katz, who wanted to know what to do about the wedding of his son. His name is Zev Yecheskel, which was scheduled to take place in Israel on the 13th of Sivan. And he wanted to know, should we cancel the wedding? Should we move the wedding to New York? Or that? And the Rebbe writes to him, the wedding, these are all documented letters of the Rebbe. The wedding will be in an auspicious hour in its designated time in the Holy Land. For dear God has assured blessing and life for all eternity. And the Rebbe went so far as to decry all of the uncertainty that people were feeling. The Rebbe writes, I am very pleased by the panic. I'm very displeased by the panic and the exaggerations. God will protect all those whom you referenced among all our brethren. This is a letter in response to someone who expressed concern. The children of Israel, wherever they may be, and specifically those residing in the land where God's eyes are constantly upon it. The Rebbe's reassuring voice brought calm to a lot of people during that time, particularly the Hasidim, but really to many people. In fact, in an interview with Davar, following the Six-Day War, Israeli President Zalman Shazar said, and I quote, I did not doubt for a moment that we would be triumphant. The Rebbe called me, and it was clear that he had full faith that we would be victorious. So clearly it affected the president of Israel at the time too, not that he was the military commander, but still. The theme that Israel is a safe place, it's the place that God has his eyes over and God protects at every single moment, was a theme that the Rebbe consistently repeated throughout the years. Israel is the safest place for Jews to live, and we shouldn't think that Israel is an unsafe place. It's the safest place in the world, and that was the Rebbe's perspective always. So that's just a little treat. I'd like to conclude by reminding you that very often a lesson that we give here, especially as part of a course, doesn't end with a conclusion. I presented today 4 perspectives. I hope you find which perspective you feel is the most. Maybe it's a combination of 1 or 2 of them, and most resonates with you. But I hope that more than anything, you have perhaps more of an appreciation of other perspectives that you maybe didn't, going into this. It's something that we all are going to deal with every single day of our lives. How do we deal with that cognitive dissonance? Because it plays out in everything else. It plays out in Land for Peace. It plays out in all the other debates that there are about Israel up until today. So I will end with the question, what do you think? And with that, we'll play the recap video of this afternoon's lesson. No, that's the.
Lesson 5. Israel in Perspective. 1. In the lead-up to the Six-Day War, extreme tension and trepidation mounted in Israel and around the globe. Preparations were made for worst-case scenarios. Then came the lightning-quick, stunning victory. There was a large measure of collective cognitive dissonance that required reduction. 2. At the time, most ascribed the victory to divine intervention. The perception that a remarkable miracle had occurred led to a widespread religious reawakening, an uptick in Aliyah, and an increase in Jewish pride around the world. 3. Some refused to accept the notion that a miracle had transpired. These people reevaluated how real the threat had been and concluded that Israel was not in as precarious a position as was thought. This perspective has become increasingly pervasive in recent years. 4. Some religious Jews staunchly opposed the state due to Zionism's deeply anti-religious philosophic underpinnings. This group concluded that if there was supernatural intercession in Israel's victory, it was the Satan's work. 5. For the most part, religious communities today support the activities of the state that benefit the Jews residing in the land, despite Zionism's philosophic roots, and view Israel's ability to self-govern as a gift from God. 6. Religious Zionists view the establishment of the state and all the wars and conquests that followed as evidence of the onset of the Messianic redemption. The Six-Day War is seen as a most significant stage of the redemption. Many, however, have difficulty defining the secular state in Messianic terms. 7. Many of the decisions that Israeli leaders contend with today are still shaped by the impact of the war. Their attempts to reconcile the cognitive dissonance produced by its outcomes mold their responses to this very day. Next week, in staggering disproportion to the size of both its land and population, Israel receives almost constant coverage in the international media and foreign forums, and the majority of this coverage is uncomplimentary. Next week, we will explore the following questions. Is the criticism and censure justifiable? Can Israel normalize its existence and affairs to the point that it will be viewed and treated as equal to the other players in the international community?
Please join us next week for Lesson 6, A Nation That Dwells Alone, Israel's Relations with the Family of Nations. Same time, same place, or 7:30 p.m. if you'd like to come in person. Thank you all for joining us.